I think you're like.
Go ahead and roll one here. So as this is firing up, hope you all have had a good weekend. Looking forward to getting back into some stuff for interviewing this week. So we have spent the last 2 weeks talking about some of the foundational building blocks of interviews. These are things that are going to be useful for you for all of the interview presentations that you do in class, and also useful for the upcoming assignment, where you'll be asked to reflect and analyze an interview of your choosing. So we have spent these last 2 weeks going over those fundamentals. The way that the rest of the course is going to be set up, we're going to be doing different types of interviews, and we're going to be alternating between sharing, talking, doing activities about some of these different types of interviews, and then doing the interview presentations in class. I will be posting the interview partnerships for the first interview assignment a little bit later today. Just waiting on a couple people who still need to get those in. So please take some time today, if you haven't already, to submit that Google form, and then I will have that posted in just a minute. So getting started for today, we took some time last week to talk about some of the ways that we can effectively open and close interviews, right? Building trust, goodwill, explaining the purpose and goals of the interview are all really important things to do early on. We also talked about how we can use this in a variety of settings. We did an activity in which you all were asked to interview somebody that you were interested in, such as a celebrity. A lot of you chose, for example, an athlete, a motivational figure, somebody that particularly stood out to you, and trying to understand more about them. So as you're doing some of the interviews in this class, you're thinking about how you're going to structure as an interviewer. You might be thinking about how you utilize one of these different styles of organization. As we talked about last class too, they have advantages and disadvantages. They are designed to provide a good flow for the interview. And again, the important thing for you to think about is, how are the goals of the interview aligning with the way that you're presenting the questions? For today, we'll be taking some time to look at the style of interviewing known as the informational interview, right? This is one of the most commonly used types of interviews. It has a lot of different applications and examples, and is one of the things that you'll be integrating into the survey interview presentation for this class. So the informational interview is, generally speaking, what we often see if we're looking at an interview in media, if we're looking at an example such as a press conference, or somebody is sitting down and giving an interview one-on-one, or perhaps you're somebody such as a journalist, a researcher, you're seeking out information, right? The way to think about the informational interview is that the goal is to extract and gain information from the interviewee. So, the length, the expectations, the formatting, all of those general things are going to look really different depending upon the type of interview, the goal and the purpose that you're giving. But generally, you're trying to gain that information. You're trying to get insights in regard to what's going on with the interviewee. Sometimes there's somebody that is incredibly unique. They come in with a very specific lived experience. Perhaps their perspective, background, experiences on life are very useful. For example, in interpersonal communication, I ask folks to interview someone close to them, such as a friend or relative, and describe those experiences. Sometimes the information is coming just from an average person, right? So you might be familiar with a lot of shows, including late night shows, that like to do the thing where they go around and like ask random people questions. Sometimes it comes in trying to gather a general sentiment from someone. But generally speaking, there's something about the interviewee that we need to learn, and something about the interviewee that needs to be learned that's just not in common knowledge or understanding. So one of the best things that you can do in order to develop a successful informational interview, particularly if you're the person creating and designing the interview process, is the use of good preparation skills. So first of all, right, it's important for us to ask, what is it that I need to know? This is incredibly crucial for an informational interview because one of the worst things that you can do is ask an interviewee a question that you can just get from a basic Google search or search of their social media presence, such as a LinkedIn profile, right? That is harmful for two reasons. First of all, it wastes your time. You can easily do a search, your time is limited in the interview, and you're not really getting information about the interview, right? Second of all, that can be seen as disrespectful to the interviewee. If somebody has taken the time, work, and effort to come in and be interviewed, they're going to want to share details and things that aren't as basic. If somebody is coming in and they're asking basic information, such as, well, what is your job, right? And the entire interview is about their job, then they might feel that the interviewer is not prepared, doesn't really care, is not going to be able to ask good questions. So breaking the ice does involve the interviewer showing that they've done their homework. Who is best able to provide the information that I need, right? So if you were asking about the inner workings of a chemical plant, right, you're probably not going to talk to somebody who just got hired a week ago, right? So you want to think carefully about asking questions to a person that really knows their stuff. Oftentimes, if you're dealing with somebody who's in a more entry or middle management level role and you're really seeking out information from leadership, you're going to get a lot of non-committal or deference style responses, right? Somebody says, well, I don't know that question. That's above my pay grade. You should ask my boss, right? Those are the types of responses that are common if you're not dealing with the appropriate level of leadership that you're looking for here. That's another really good thing that you can do if you are seeking out or if somebody's interviewing you and you just don't feel like you have the preparation or ability to answer the questions, right? We would host a whole bunch of speech and debate tournaments on our campus. There'd be a whole lot of people, a whole lot of events. One of the worst things that would happen was when people we would have younger students who would give us responses to questions or tell us things that were just not correct, right? That people didn't have the experience or understanding of to be able to answer properly. So don't answer questions as an interviewee unless you know that you're able to answer those questions accurately, you're in a position that equips you to answer those questions, and so on. How quickly do you need information? So in a lot of cases, such as journalism, there's a bit of a rush. People got to get a story out, they need to get a headline out. Oftentimes there are interviews that are very on the top, that are very quick. So one of the things you need to ask yourself is, how do I get that interview set up in light of the timeline that I have? Oftentimes, if you are assigned an interview for a research project, you're seeking out people, you're trying to reach out, or your interview assignment, reaching out as soon as possible can be important. One of the biggest reasons why is scheduling conflicts. People are not going to be able to go in to an interview at any given time. They're going to have limited availability in terms of travel, logistics, and so on. So really coordinating that interview carefully really matters. And then also asking yourself, how am I going to use the information? Sometimes people in journalism, they're looking for a soundbite, they're looking for a quote, and they're structuring an interview with that in mind. This is a mutually important issue, right? How will I use this information is important as an interviewer so that it helps you to know what it is that you're seeking out, but it's also crucially important as an interviewee. People are a lot more comfortable, they're willing to participate in the interview process if they understand how their information is being used. For example, right, I got an interview one time, somebody was writing a book and they were asking about the use of kind of sensory inclusive support in spaces like libraries. And I'm like, well, why do you need to know this information? How am I going to be quoted? One of the things that can be incredibly useful is what's known as a member check, right? So if you're ever doing research or you're ever doing journalism or related story, one thing that you can do is conduct the interview, and if you know that you're going to be quoted or referenced in the interview, ask to look at how you're being referenced and used. What is the quotation that's being used for you, right? And one thing you can do as an interviewer is just to provide what about you is being used and double check that that's okay. Hey, I have this quote here where you talk about how, EOU was not your first choice, but it was your best choice. Is that a response that you're comfortable having included in this interview, right? So being really careful is important. People don't like being quoted out of context. People don't like that, they might have an incorrect response. Sometimes people are a little bit vague and unclear in their language choices, or they might be misinterpreted. So you want to make sure that you are getting the accurate information. So there's a saying here on informational interviews. If you know what you want, you're already halfway there, right? What is it that you're trying to get from the interviewee? What is it that you hope to achieve through that interview process? You know the answer to that question, then you've really started to develop an effective interview. Again, think back to a lot of examples of popular interviews, shows such as Hot Ones, right, where there are very specific questions that show that people understand the roles, experience, and talent of the people who are being involved in the interview. So the process of developing good research to conduct an informational interview is crucially important. Again, as mentioned, you don't want to conduct an interview in which all of the information is already available and the interview is essentially redundant, right? You're not getting anything useful. You're not getting the spark. You're not getting the nuggets of the interview that can really help it go well. So the process of conducting research is revealing information that's readily available. Again, things that are present on somebody's social media page. It can be awkward early on to be like, oh no, I've stalked this person on social media, and it's going to be weird that they know things about the interviewee that I don't want them to know. But the idea is that the interviewee does expect that you've done research and work on it. That's a helpful starting point, and it shows that you care about them. The process of doing research is also going to reveal things that you might not have considered. A few years ago, I was interviewing for a job, and I noticed that there was a member of the faculty that I was interviewing for that had just gotten back from doing a year-long research study abroad, right? So when he was interviewing me, I was asking him questions. What was this like? What were some of the things that you studied and learned from that travel experience? And he was really excited to share. So sometimes there's things that you learn either about the interviewer who's interviewing you that you can ask them about so that they can express their own interest, or things that you learn as an interviewer about the person that you're interviewing. I had no idea that you grew up in Eastern Washington. I actually grew up really close by. What was that experience like for you? This also prevents you from coming in with false information, right? Oftentimes you might come into interviews with expectations, assumptions, and beliefs that might not be correct or accurately represent the experiences of the interviewee. So think about the process of this as a fact check. Or perhaps you find information online, like somebody says that they've been involved in this for 5 years, but they also, it looks like on their resume, were only involved for 2 years. So what's that discrepancy? So pointing out that information, resolving any sort of factual disputes can be an important thing in the interview too. Good research, right, allows you to ask an engaging and thought-provoking question. So for instance, you were in the Situation Room in 9/11 when you heard the news, right? What was that experience like? What was it like in there as you were trying to address that crisis, right? So recognizing that somebody was involved in a significant issue or topic and asking questions really around that topic is not only good for them to engage, but it also shows that you care enough to dig into those issues. Good research lets you set up an interview guide. Again, in this class, I'm going to be asking you to create interview guides in preparation for each of the interviews that you do in class. The interview guide is a chance for you to develop an overall framework, including the types of questions, the possible probes that you might ask, and you're doing that informed by the research and preparation that you've put in. One thing you should avoid doing in an interview is telling the interviewee, at least for too much detail, things that you already know, right? So if you go in and you just have this kind of monologue, So I understand that you were involved in the Air Force for 5 years, and then after that you graduated, and then you went on to pursue a master's in education. And then I recognize that you went off to, Kentucky for a while. Like if you're sharing that just like biographical information, that's space you're taking and sucking out of the room that the interviewee could be using to talk about those experiences, right? A much better way to do this is to have questions that show that you've done that knowledge, right? So you might ask, what motivated you to join the Air Force? And that can be a good way to show that you've done that research and homework, and that can help to guide the rest of the questions so that you don't just gloss over those important details. One of the things to think about here, right, is as you develop this interview, you want to think about who it is that you're picking to conduct the interview. So you might have a range of options, whether you are working for a company or group that's seeking out information, whether you're doing a research project and you're fielding participants, whether you have been tasked with trying to gain understanding about a topic. So there's a few different things that are important for you to think about here. First of all, how much knowledge does the person have about the topic? So for instance, if somebody is asking about the experiences of directing a film, well, how many films have they directed? How much have they been involved in that role? If you're trying to understand what it's like for the experiences of teachers or professors at EOU, you should probably not ask somebody who's here for the first time, although there are contexts in which somebody who's coming in with an early or more layperson knowledge is what it is that you're looking for. If you're looking for a first impression, what do first-year students think about their time here at EOU? What is it like as a new student? Sometimes that knowledge level can actually be a really useful way to get started too. Secondarily, you've got to think about availability, right? People are busy, they've got things going on in their lives. An interview is a time suck, especially if the person is not being compensated for that time. So they're going to be taking a big chunk out of their lives in order to participate in the interview. And also, given the modality they might be using, the level and involvement they have is going to be different. If you're bringing in somebody from hours away, that's going to be a pretty big factor. So plan out in advance, reach out ahead of time, check in, send a list of possible times for the interview. Third of all, of course, is willingness. So many of you have probably read an article, for example, for a newspaper or other publication, right? And you might have noticed over the course of the interview that somebody says there was a request. We reached out to this company for comments and they did not provide a comment. Or we reached out to this organization for clarification and did not receive a response, right? Sometimes journalists, information seekers are going to reach out to groups, not receive a response, and that's going to dictate what information they're able to gather. They might even disclose a lack of response. Others can be really generous, really open, really willing. So this is an important thing to think about. You might ask yourself, why would an interviewee want to participate? What's in it for them? Whether they want to share their experiences, whether they are gaining something like compensation, or whether they're invested in the outcome of the interview. Again, that's a really important thing here. If you're asking students about their experience at EOU, you say our goal is to really improve your experience, make sure you're having the best time possible, you're going to be more likely to respond because they understand that the outcome of that interview is going to benefit them. And then somebody's level of competence, right? Fact of the matter is, not everybody is the best at interviewing. It can be a skill that you can develop in terms of your ability to respond or answer questions, but you have to think about the audience. Is this an interview that's live, that's going to be recorded? Are people going to be asked to give responses in real time? Or is this something where the results are going to be published and put in a story? So sometimes people do not come in with a whole lot of confidence, expertise, or willingness in the interview process. We have seen a lot of examples, for instance, people who are not ready for prime time, right? Who come in, kind of bomb interviews because they just haven't put in the work. There are a lot of examples of people who might be really experienced, who have done a lot of interviews in the past, who have been successful, but then they have an interview or engagement that just doesn't go well, right? So for example, right, we've seen a lot of press conferences over the years, right, where sometimes press secretaries, presidents, political leaders will have really good thought out responses to questions. Other times we hear a lot of gaps, a lot of blunders, people who say things that are inaccurate or that they have to backtrack on later, right? So just because you prepared for one interview does not mean you were generally prepared or competent for all of them. So I like to think about, you might be familiar with the film, it's got a more recent adaptation, right? Interview with a Vampire, which I think is kind of fun, right? Because if you think about interviewing a vampire, or you watch a show, I really enjoy What We Do in the Shadows, right? Where it's structured in the kind of mockumentary style, where like various vampires are being interviewed. Part of the challenge in those types of interviews is that there is very much a power differential. If you're interviewing a vampire, you most certainly do not want that vampire to eat you, and you kind of know that they could. So one of the challenges in those types of interviews is like the interviewer being very cautious in how they respond to questions because they don't want to get the vampire angry. So this kind of relates to the role of power in interviewing, right? If you think about interviewing as interpersonal communication, it's meaningful, it's between two or more people. The interview is very much implicated by the role the power has. So if the interviewer, right, and when we're talking about status, we're not talking about socioeconomic status, we're talking about the level of expertise that a person has on a given topic, right? So if an interviewer does not have as much expertise, background, material that they need, generally speaking, the interviewee is going to be at an advantage. They don't feel like they need to posture as much. Sometimes they're less threatened, and they're more able to speak openly about some of the things that are on their mind. Again, I go back to the example of when I was in high school, I got in a journalism class, and the teacher immediately asked me to interview the assistant principal, right? I was freaked out. There was a big power differential there, but the assistant principal was very nice, was very kind, was very open. And when you find yourself kind of engaged with somebody who's less experienced in the interview process, you oftentimes take on a more director style role. And you might more agentically say, well, what other questions do you have for me? Or would you like to know about this topic? So oftentimes there's greater direction on the part of the interviewee to guide the discussion in their favor. If the interviewer has higher status, right? So for instance, you have a very experienced, seasoned interviewer who brings in a lot of preparation, who asks very hard-hitting questions. Oftentimes, an interviewer is going to control the interview. They've got their questions, they've got their points, they want to make sure that they're addressing them in the interview and really showing that level of engagement. They also have the potential to reward the interviewee. For instance, maybe there's a financial compensation, maybe to get a free copy of a book for their work and so on. And oftentimes, in this role, an interviewee is motivated to cooperate because they recognize and perhaps look up to the interviewer. If they know that they're going to be in the Oregonian tomorrow, they're going to be careful about their responses. And if you are interviewing somebody of equal status, right? So you're interviewing a peer, as you'll be doing in the class, about their experiences here at EOU, there's a lot of advantages interviewing somebody who's coming in from a similar perspective as you. One of them being the ability to establish rapport, to create natural communication, openness and friendliness can generally be a lot easier to do. You both have a similar starting point. The communication barriers that you encounter with that person are lower too. You're coming from different perspectives, or you're coming from similar perspectives. Perhaps you're involved in the same games, activities, and so on. And there's oftentimes greater empathy and understanding too. You're a student interviewing a student, you both kind of get a lot of similar experiences that make sense for you to disclose in an interview. Another thing that's important if you're developing an interview effectively is to think about location, right? Why are you holding the interview in the place that you're holding it? So if you think about an interview is a sensory process. It's not just about the audio, it's not just about the words that are exchanged, but it's about the location in which that exchange of words and ideas is happening. For example, perhaps you are interviewing the CEO of a chemical plant, right? And you want to understand how this chemical plant works, how it's organized, how employees are using that space, right? You might ask them to conduct a tour with you. And as you're going around the different spots of the plant, you're asking questions. You know, what does What does this space do? How old is this part of the building? This looks like it was remodeled. What's going on? So in other words, the use of place and space can actually be a way for you to help use follow-ups, engage dynamically in the questioning process, and so on, right? Or you might think about using something like a tour. So for instance, you're guiding somebody on the EOU campus, you're showing them around, and you're giving them the opportunity to ask questions. What's going on in this building? Where would I go if I wanted to get lunch? So using the location in a way that's appropriate can be really useful. This is also really closely tied to power too, right? Because if you are somebody who is interviewing someone in a space that's more their territory or turf, for instance, you're interviewing somebody in their own office, they're going to feel more comfortable. It's their space. They get to dictate where you sit, and they have comfort with that location versus asking somebody to come into your space. So it's useful for you to think about where you're doing that interview. You might also think about, for example, who's hosting the meeting if you're doing like a Zoom meeting or something similar. So as you prepare for an interview, it's a good idea for you to establish ground rules, right? That's an agreement between the interviewer and interviewee as to how that interview is happening. Sometimes that can be shared verbally in an interview. Other times it can be something that is asked ahead of time, for instance, using an instruction manual or some form of written explanation as to what happens. So ground rules are important because, especially if you're dealing with a very experienced interviewee, they're going to be people who might try to dodge or get around questions. So one thing that sometimes interviewees try to do is to say, I don't really like that question. Can you ask me a different one, right? Or I don't really want to answer that. Or say, I want you to strike that from the record. I don't like my response. I want my response to be this instead. So you need to be clear between interviewer and interviewee if that flies or not, right? You might say, I'm going to ask you a series of questions. You can respond as much or as little as you would like to these questions, but we do need to follow the structure of questions as they're presented, right? So no comment or next question. That can be a strategy that's used, especially in public relations settings where people are dealing with uncomfortable scenarios. Generally speaking, for these types of interviews, moderate scheduling is good. In other words, having an interview guide that hits on the basics, but still allows you to use probing and follow-up questions in a way that works for you is really important, right? So who, what, when, where, why, and how are good examples of probing questions. So if somebody is talking about how they developed a new pastry, how did you develop this? Why did you make this, right? Who helped you to become a cook? So using those types of questions is a really good way, who, what, when, where, why, how, as a way of digging a little bit deeper into the nitty-gritty of what it is you want to learn. When it comes to motivating, right, one thing to be careful about is what you do and do not ask in the interview, right? So being cautious, being cognizant of the other people's needs is important. Again, as mentioned before, in something like a job interview, asking things such as pregnancy status or somebody's marital status is generally really appropriate and often illegal. Explaining the purpose carefully, explaining why we're here, again, as we've talked about. Showing respect and a willingness to participate and be involved is important too. Showing that you want to be here, that you have done your homework, and that you're coming in with a real desire to learn about this person is good. Sincerity goes a long way in terms of how you express yourself verbally and non-verbally. Using eye contact, perhaps taking notes if it makes sense in the interview to do so, are all skills that you can utilize here. Avoiding interruption unless you absolutely need to, right? There are some situations where people are going to just go on and on about irrelevant topics and you do need to ground them. But generally speaking, if somebody's talking in an informational interview, they're giving you information you get to use later. Like, this is what you want, and this can be hard to initiate. So letting somebody really talk and share those nuggets can be useful. Making it planned and professional, again, coming in with a guide, coming in with expectations and ground rules, and being patient. You have had time to think through questions. Interviewees, sometimes they have to go back in their brains. They have to think about how they're going to restructure their response. So you're going to want to make sure that you are respecting that person and their boundaries. This ties to note-taking and recording, right? An interview is something that if all you do is like listen and pay attention to it and you don't have anything to go off of later, you're just drawing from memory, and that can be a source of inconsistencies and problems. Somebody claims something was said in an interview, but there's no way to prove it. So the use of note-taking can be good. It can be good to take some notes, to jot down points such as key names and figures. That can be a good way to set up probing questions. So you mentioned a coworker named Danielle. Can you tell me a bit more about this person, right? So that can be a good way to engage with the interviewee and show your interest. If you're like scribbling and taking down intensive notes, that can sometimes feel a little bit like an interrogation, a little bit anxiety-inducing on the part of the interviewee. So you do want to be careful about that. One really common practice is the use of recording, right? So the use of recording is useful, but it's really important for you to be careful about how you are recording for an interview. One big thing is to always ask permission in advance, right? Informed consent matters. Say, is it all right if I record this interview? That's an important thing you can do as you're starting that out. Don't say, surprise, you've been recorded. This is going on national television, right? That can be a big source of problems. Explaining why it is that you're recording. We want to record this interview because we're going to be looking back through the candidates' questions one by one and seeing their responses again. That can be a thing to be really careful about. Recording can be helpful because you're not spending the interview taking notes on them. You have something where you can immediately go back and clarify and make sure that you've got things like quotations exactly as they are, right? And if an interview is publicly available, it's recorded for posterity. People can watch it and understand what's going on later. There are difficult types of interviews that we can think about here too, right? One of the biggest ones being a press conference. We've seen this a lot of times in political contexts, right? Like a press secretary, but we also see this in the context of businesses, companies, organizations, and so on, right? If you've seen Iron Man, Tony Stark, like at the end of that film, tells in a press conference, a big crowded group of people, I am Iron Man, right? An example here about how the pressures to disclose, to share information about you and your life can be a huge influence on your communication. A broadcast interview, somebody's on national television, they're asked to speak in front of a group, right? That can be a big challenge as well, because sometimes people are not ready for a large broadcast, or sometimes, right, the structure and line of questioning from journalists can be such that people feel unprepared, right? There's a lot of critique of how a lot of interviews might be structured as gotcha, right? Using trivia, using very obscure questions, or things that somebody does not feel prepared to answer in that moment. And another challenge to consider, of course, is the role of video conferencing using things such as Zoom and Google Meets, right? You do have the opportunity to engage with people from all around the world, but it's also true that in these types of interviews, it can be very easy for people to like lose a connection, lose a signal, not capture things correctly, or just not being as engaged. Oftentimes, there's a drop off in energy level that tends to come in some of these kind of video conference style interviews. So I wanted to share an example of kind of one of the most infamous interviews in terms of lack of preparation and engagement. Again, as I have said before, and I'll say again, bad interview preparation is not limited to a single political party or group. For example, there are a lot of examples of bad press conferences and interviews as conveyed by the current administration. But I do want to show an example of a particularly infamous interview that came out around 2008, right? So if you recall, 2008 presidential election was between former Senator John McCain and his running mate, Sarah Palin, the former governor of Alaska, right? She was somebody who came in with a lot of knowledge as to kind of Alaska and state politics, but there were a lot of challenges with adjusting to a sort of national interview climate, right? That's something where sometimes people have experience, they have background in the state, but when they pivot to the national level, that doesn't go so well. So kind of there was this major interview in which she was asked a series of questions that garnered a lot of infamy in its responses and the quality of those responses.
Republican vice presidential candidate Sarah Palin kept up her busy schedule today, meeting with several world leaders who are here in New York for the UN session.
On a much more local level, then also rallying against is the undue influence of lobbyists in public policy decisions being made.
Then we focused on the $700 billion government bailout of bad debt. And I asked her if she supports it.
Ill about the position that America is in, and that we have to look at the $700 billion bailout. At the same time, we know that inaction is not an option. And as Senator McCain has said, unless this nearly $1 trillion bailout is what it may end up to be, unless there are amendments in policy's proposal, really, I don't believe that Americans are going to support this, and we will not support this. That means that other nations in the region need in order to win this war on terrorism.
You've cited Alaska's proximity to Russia as part of your foreign policy experience. What did you mean by that?
That Alaska has a very narrow maritime border between a foreign country, Russia, and on our other side, the land boundary that we have with Canada. It's funny that a comment like that was kind of made to I don't know, reporters. Yeah, mocked, I guess that's the word, yeah.
Well, explain to me why that enhances your foreign policy credentials.
Well, it certainly does, because our next door neighbors are foreign countries. They're in the state that I am the executive of. And
Have you ever been involved with any negotiations, for example, with the Russians?
we have trade missions back and forth. It's very important when you consider even national security issues with Russia, as Putin rears his head and comes into the airspace of the United States of America. Where do they go? It's Alaska. It's just right over the border. It is from Alaska that we send those out to make sure that an eye is being kept on this very powerful nation, Russia, because they are right there. They are right next to our state.
When President Bush ran for office,
So, you can kind of take a couple of different angles with this, right? On the one end, as she does bring up, there are like relevant, perhaps trade relations, agreements that might be formed, but that's not the experience that's really being conveyed in the interview. Like this line of questioning is, how is foreign policy experience gained by geographical proximity? And there's not really a specific answer to that question, right? So one of the challenges of effective interviewing is, on the one end, you want to convey your expertise, but you also want to make sure that that's being applied effectively to the question. Palin was heavily critiqued for how she responded to that interview question, right? We can argue how fairly that critique was. A lot of people were kind of essentializing it down to, well, I can see Russia from my house. That's why I'm qualified to be president, which is not exactly what's happening here, but there is very much an inability to link the experience to the question in an effective way, right? So regardless of political affiliation, background, experience, lack of preparation for an interview can be a really big problem. It's important for us to think about how preparation can allow us to engage, and also to engage given some of the lines of questioning that can be really challenging. Interviews can be emotional, especially if people self-disclose and share information that is very near and dear to their hearts. People can also be hostile. They can confront, they can end interviews, right? Just because somebody is frustrated or angry does not necessarily mean that they are feeling that way toward you. It could be that they have just come in with a topic that is a source of challenge. People are also reticent at times. They're not willing to share or divulge into details. One of the biggest ways around that is to develop rapport, to develop good communication skills and engagement. You can also have interviews where people are too talkative. They just go on and on about irrelevant topics. And when you find a good pause, it's a good way to reposition and focus the topic elsewhere. And people can be evasive. They can refuse to answer the question, right? It's like trying to see a politician answer a yes or no question. It's very difficult to see in practice because people don't necessarily want to commit to a decision that they're not fully confident. So evasive interviews are common too, and reframing or asking the question differently can be a good way to address that. As an interviewee who's receiving that information, right? Clear, concise responses, being clear, having what I like to call an overview sentence, where in the very beginning of the response, you have a direct answer to that question. Another thing you can do is to use the language of the question in your response, or alternatively, you can write down the question as you're being given it so that you can refer back to it. I've seen so many interviews where people will start to respond to something immediately, and then they say, wait, what was the question? Right? So make sure you fully understand before you respond. Mnemonic and memory devices can be really useful. So for example, you know that the person interviewing you is Shelly, and you might say Shelly, Shelly, Shelly over and over in your head, or you might think about like a shell on the beach to help you to remember who that is. Listening and thinking carefully. It's a good idea to just like take a couple seconds, even if it feels awkward, before you respond to an interview question. It just makes sure that you're not just flying off the handle and filling in space. It allows you to instead pare that down a bit more to the key ideas. And then utilizing skills in active listening, right? Showing your attentiveness, your engagement, using eye contact, nodding, and showing that you care and are involved. So for today's scenario, I'm going to ask you to take a bit of time on the following topic. You're asked to better understand how timber is managed and used in Eastern Oregon. In groups, I want you to take some time and have one person write or type for your groups. Who would you interview? Find a relevant name that you might consider for this interview. How might you prepare for this interview through the use of research? And then what types of questions might you ask in this interview? So I will let you all pick groups again. So find some folks perhaps sitting near you or people you'd like to work with. Can be anywhere between 2 to maybe 5 or 6. Take some time to work together and develop your answers to these questions. You'll have about 10 minutes to do that.
I'm not. That's it. Let's find out someone. We go back to no, we just like they get political infection. Regardless of like regulations for logging. So let's go. The reviews. Would.
Take about 3 or 4 minutes here.
How will be fair? And we gotta figure out how to deal with it. We know what we need to figure out. Don't have that. We know how to. Yes, it does. We don't have any. No, it doesn't.
Take another minute to wrap up here.
I would have with an Nancy or Woodburn. We need to learn a little bit more.
Go ahead and finish your Connor idea.
Well, I understand. Questions on like what would
So in hearing your responses here, I think you all did a good job. You were looking at finding examples of people you might reach out to, such as local businesses or companies, right? You're never going to get the whole scoop, but perhaps getting a good representation of somebody through that process. So I enjoyed seeing how you might frame and use questions. And again, doing that upfront researching, gathering information, it's a good way to start doing the interviews as well. While you were working on that, I went ahead and posted the interview schedule for the survey interviews based off of the availability form that you filled out. So feel free to give that a look. Let me know if you have any conflicts. We'll be taking some time on Wednesday and Friday for you to work with people in your group, get to know them, and we'll also be dedicating time on Wednesday and Friday for developing the survey interview, understanding it in terms of goals, purpose, and motivations. So we took some time today to talk about informational interviews, the steps involved in informational interview process. We'll be looking in more detail as to survey interviews. So between now and the next class, you might take some time